Welcome everyone to this great talk by Craig VanGrasstek, professor at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. Professor VanGrasstek will help us understand and assess the consequences of the elections at the United States of America. This great talk could not be more timely since, as we speak, the countdown is still going on and nobody knows who will win the election. Professor VanGrasstek gave to today's great talk the cliffhanger title of Either Way, It's Worse Than You Think. Either way, so is America doomed or are we all doomed? Is it worse than you think? What is happening in the Americas or what will happen in America or what will happen in the world? Well, these are many questions that I hope Greg VanGrasstek will help us. Just for the record, for those who are joining us for the first time, I will just mention a few items of the bio of Professor VanGrasstek. Craig VanGrasstek, according to The Economist in January 22nd in 2000, keeps a sharp eye on the politics of trade. His book on trade and American leadership, The Paradoxes of Power and Wealth from Alexander Hamilton to Donald Trump, examines the shifting place of trade policy in the grand strategy of the United States from independence to the struggle with China for global primacy. He also wrote The History and Future of the World Trade Organization, as well as numerous other books, articles, and monographs. Professor VanGrasstek has taught courses on trade policy at the Harvard University School since the year 2000, having also taught international economics at the American University School of International Service and literature at Georgetown University School of Foreign Service. He has lectured in the diplomatic academies of the United States, the United Kingdom, and 10 other countries. He received his doctorate in political science from Princeton University and a Master of Science in Foreign Service degree from Georgetown University. He has provided advisory, analytical, and training services to numerous international organizations, national governments, and private firms in over 4 dozen countries. So Manuela Tortora, our Vice President at Gracels, will conduct the sessions, and we are all delighted to have Craig with us and looking forward to hearing him. Manuela, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Alejandro. Just as a reminder to everybody, we had already a great talk with Craig VanGrasstek in June, mid-June, also on the US policies, but more looking at the US in the international system, so the foreign policy. But this is a sort of continuation because, as Alejandro said, we should all vote in the US elections because we are all concerned. So Craig, what are the surprises that we have to be prepared to in the next few days or weeks? Over to you.
Okay, well, that is where I want to start, just to give people a little preview of what I want to cover. And thank you both for the introduction and the invitation. I want to structure my remarks in 3 ways. I want to talk about the immediate issues. And by immediate, I mean what happens between now and January 20th, when we have the inauguration. I want to talk about what the election means for the domestic politics of trade in the United States, and to what extent this promotes or retards our ability to make policy. And then I want to finish up on what it means for the international politics of trade and the position of the United States and what role the United States may be playing in the world in the coming 4 years as a consequence of this election. And in so doing, I'm going to be moving back and forth between what is domestic and what's international, what's immediate, what's medium term, and what is long term. For those of you who know some of my work in the past, I define myself as a trade historian. So looking backwards in writing my book on the history and future of the WTO, I tried to put that institution and multilateralism in an historical context. My book on trade and American leadership is attempting to address where the world is when it relied so heavily on the leadership of one country in establishing and maintaining an open trading system, seeing this as part of what is called in political science a theory of hegemonic stability, the idea that when you have a leader, like the United Kingdom was in the 19th century, like the United States was in the 20th century, we tend to find it easier to establish and maintain an open trading system when you see a decline in the relative position of that leader, and when you see a redistribution of power and wealth globally, it becomes more difficult to establish and maintain a system of that sort. And that was really the theme, the principal theme of my most recent book. It's going to be the underlying theme throughout this discussion, although we'll see where we go once we get to general discussion. I'm going to aim to talk for 30, 35 minutes, something like that, but I think mostly we do well when we have open discussion and questions about these issues. But I had entitled my talk, Either Way, It's Worse Than You Think, because we didn't know what the outcome of the election would be. I think we now have a very good idea what the outcome of the election is. I'll turn to that in a moment. But I wouldn't want people to enter into this topic the same way that people did when I happened to be in Geneva around the time that President Obama was inaugurated in 2009. And some friends of mine, including one who was about to become chairman of the General Council, had me give a talk to a number of the WTO ambassadors. And the feeling in the room was, oh, now we can solve the round. You know, now everything's been settled in the United States. The United States can play its traditional role. And I took it as my task to try to take them down in their expectations a bit by explaining why we hadn't resolved our internal political problems over trade yet. In fact, they were being exacerbated. And why I saw at that time an increasing drift away from multilateralism and towards more discrimination in our foreign policy. And I don't think that we have fundamentally changed in the 11 years since I gave that talk. So I'll return to that when I talk about the domestic politics and the international politics. But first, the immediate questions. Everyone wants to know what finally is going to be the consequence of this election, who is going to win. I find very persuasive the arguments of those who expect that one way or another, Biden will put together the necessary 270 electoral votes. The easiest way for him to do that is to win what we currently expect him to be winning. He needs, based on the states that have been called so far, he still needs Nevada and Arizona. Nevada and Arizona will give him exactly the number he needs to have 270. There's still some question about Arizona, perhaps a little bit more question about Nevada, but increasingly the vote counts that are coming in from Pennsylvania and Georgia are suggesting that he may win either or both of those. So they could be a fallback and take the place of what we expected from Arizona and or Nevada. And you may recall, those of you who participated in the discussion that I had in June, I told you at that time, I made two predictions. I said, one, it's going to come down ultimately to Florida and Pennsylvania. And indeed, it may come down to Pennsylvania. I also predicted that at some point during the presidential campaign, at least one of these fellows was going to end up in the hospital. And I was right. I just didn't know which one and on what basis. But you know, you look at the demographics of men of that age, and you know, it wasn't a difficult forecast to make. We'll see how much of a difference that made in people's expectations. Anyway, one way or another, I consider the chances of Biden winning to be north of 75%, probably more like 90%. Today, we're going to get some important indications, but it still could be some days and counting. Part of the question, however, is how much chaos we're going to have in the ensuing days. There's going to be legal challenges in each one of the swing states. The legal experts that I listen to think that the Trump administration, the Trump campaign, I should say, we've been blurring the lines between campaign and administration, which is unfortunate and also quite possibly illegal, but I'll leave that to the side. We don't really see a basis for the challenges, although we may ultimately get to the point where if, let's say, Pennsylvania looks like Florida did 20 years ago, if it's so close that it's a matter of dozens or hundreds of votes, you could get to the point where individual votes are being challenged. Had the voter who did this absentee ballot, had they signed the ballot in the right way and that type of thing, we might end up in that. My own expectation is that that probably isn't going to make a difference in the outcome of the election. It will make a difference in how much chaos and uncertainty we have between now and January 20th. And as so many people in the commentariat have said and will tell you now, among the many and varied faults of Donald Trump is an inability not only to behave according to, but even to understand what are the basic norms of American democracy. And when I think about how Trump is likely to behave between now and January 20th, the image that comes to mind is Samson pulling down the temple, you know, essentially committing a type of personal and national suicide. He doesn't care about anyone other than himself. There is no expectation that what is necessary is to recognize the democratic will of the people and recognize the authority of the elections that we have and engage in the transition. People don't understand how complicated the American system of government is, that we really need to start working on the transition almost the day after the election in order to have a new government in place effectively operating by January 20th. And in the past, when we have had delays in the results of the election, this has meant that not only do we have chaos in the transition period, but the new government has a hard time getting up and running. The prospect for Trump doing all sorts of strange things between now and January 20th, including possibly pulling the United States out of the WTO, for example, if he wanted to be Samson-like in pushing down the pillars. I would not be shocked if this were the time that he decided to do something of that sort. But the simple answer to the question is, unless I am terribly wrong and unless the numbers are terribly wrong, the question is not whether Biden is going to be below 270 votes. It's whether, in addition to the necessary 270, he may be closer to, let's say, 290 or possibly even north of that. But between now and January 20th is going to be a mess. I can return to these issues if anyone wants when we get to Q&A. But let me just use that as the point of departure for my discussion of the domestic and international politics of trade. Let us assume for the time being that we're looking at a Biden administration and not a second term of a Trump administration. I think most of us could extrapolate from the experience we've had so far under Trump what could happen if we had 4 more years. But I don't think that we need to discuss that. I think we need to focus on where we are headed in a Biden administration that unfortunately will be starting from a much weaker position than presidents normally start due to special factors. One is, it's an unspoken premise that this may be the first intentionally one-term president that we have had in recent American history. It's possible that 4 years hence, Biden will still be a spry, wise old man who wants to run for re-election. I would not be terribly surprised if between now and 4 years hence, we're looking at there being another quest for a new Democratic nominee on the basis of age and health and so forth. That makes me wonder to what extent he may be entering office as a lame duck from the start, and how much control that gives him over his own party and over the struggle that's been taking place within his party, to which I'll return in a moment. Second issue is divided government. And I think, as everyone is probably well aware, in the United States, we have not only the possibility, but the statistical likelihood of divided government being defined as whenever either chamber of Congress is controlled by a party other than the party that controls the White House. And I go through the statistics of this in my previous book, but basically, prior to the last 40 years or so, divided government was very rare. In the last 40 years, divided government has been the norm, except when a president is first elected. And the norm has been that a president enters office with both chambers of Congress in his column. There are relatively few exceptions to that. The likelihood is that Republicans will continue to control the Senate. There's even a slight possibility that they may control the House, although I doubt that. I think that we will ultimately see Democrats having lost a few seats, but maintaining their majority in the House. But how rare is this? We have not had a president entering office without unified government since George W. Bush in 1988. And I checked, the last time a Democrat entered office with divided government was 1884. So he will not have that advantage, and he will not have the capacity that his predecessors have had. Let me go through the most recent record. Bill Clinton entered office with unified government. He had it for only 2 years. 6 of his 8 years were with divided government. The only time in his presidency that he was very effective in trade policy making was the first 2 years. He was able to accomplish a few things in his latter 6 years, but it was much more difficult because trade policy making is one of those areas where you really do need to have unified government in order to achieve the type of centrist bipartisan bargains that are necessary to policy making. George W. Bush, he had 6 years of unified government and then 2 years of divided government. He was able to do a lot of things in trade policy in 6 years, including negotiating and approving a long series of free trade agreements. And then it got very difficult his last 2 years, and trade policy was put on hold for 2 years. Obama had 2 years of unified government and then 6 years of divided government. And just like Clinton, he had a greater capacity to make trade policy in his first 2 years. Where he differed from Clinton is he didn't want to make trade policy. He wanted to make social policy. So when he turned to trade policy in his latter 6 years, it was much more difficult to do. Trump will have gone from 2 years of unified government to 2 years of divided government. And you've seen that those 2 years have not only been harder for policymaking, but in fact, they've been slowed down by impeachment, by all sorts of partisan wrangling. The last 2 years have been even less effective than the first 2. Mitch McConnell, it appears, almost certain, is going to retain his position as majority leader in the Senate. And Mitch McConnell defines his job when he is in opposition as making life as difficult as possible for a Democratic president. He very famously said early in the Obama administration, our job is to see to it that Obama is a one-term president. Well, he didn't succeed in that job. Obama was a 2-term president, but he did make life as difficult as he could for Obama. And I think one of the main ways that Republicans are going to define their existence in the next couple of years is being the anti-Biden party. Pro what? We don't know pro what. And that's part of what I want to turn to in a moment, is what is the purpose of a political party other than the tautological definition of one that seeks to win re-election and be in power? Sorry about that. Why do we have political parties? Why do we have platforms? One of the legacies of Donald Trump is going to be a shattering of the expectation that the Republican Party stands for anything. And we saw that very formally in the convention held this year. Do you know what they approved as a platform? Nothing. There is no Republican platform. Essentially, Trump has tried to, and to a considerable degree, succeeded in transforming the Republican Party from a party of principle to a cult of personality. And basically, Republicans said that we support whatever Donald Trump wants to do. And Donald Trump, among other things, made protectionism and economic nationalism the foundation of his policy. And we don't know where Republicans may be headed on that issue. So let me turn to that issue beyond divided government, of what the purpose of a political party may be and what the positions of our political parties may be. All right. Most of you probably think of Republicans as being traditionally the free trade party, Democrats as being traditionally the protectionist party. These are recent traditions. And I think I said this in the previous talk, but let me re-emphasize this point, that from the 1860s to the 1960s, the one issue that divided the parties more than anything else was trade policy. Democrats were free traders and internationalists. Republicans were much more interested in domestic policy, and they were protectionists. Now, over time, there has continued to be a strong internationalist wing in the Democratic Party, but the support of Democrats for free trade has significantly diminished, except to the extent that the internationalist wing views it as being an important tool of foreign policy. So what has happened in our trade politics, and again, this is one of the principal themes of my book, is trade has been transformed from an economic issue into a partisan social issue where we have our parties divided over the trade and issues, trade and the environment, trade and labor, trade and sanctions, etc. And this has made trade policymaking much more difficult. If you think of Republicans as being free traders, you have to bear in mind that, first of all, this is a relatively recent development. It's one that really dates primarily to the Reagan administration, and even then, only the second half of the Reagan administration. I first started doing trade. I moved to Washington during the first term of the Reagan administration, and at that time, some of the things that Ronald Reagan was doing were the most protectionist moves that any American president had made in the 20th century. A lot of the import restrictions that were put in place on steel, on sugar, on textiles and apparel, on automobiles. But in his second term, he made trade a priority and he pulled his party along with him, and the Republicans became free traders. But it's exactly during that period that the trade and issues start to attract the interest of Democrats. And it used to be relatively easy to resolve partisan disputes over trade policy through compromise. But when you start dealing with issues that are essentially, the character of the issues we deal with today are more like the character of issues like abortion than the character of issues like what rate our sales tax should be. And the same legislators who can rather calmly discuss whether our sales tax ought to be 3% or 5% or 7%, they can't discuss abortion in that same way. Well, when trade gets attached to issues that have that type of emotional baggage attached to them, not only do we expand the scope of interested parties domestically, and I discuss this at some length in my book as well, we're bringing in a wider range of groups, but they are groups that are not fundamentally devoted to getting to yes, they're fundamentally devoted to advancing the particular issue they associate themselves with. And that has gotten worse over time. But it's been made worse still by the advent of Donald Trump, because with Donald Trump having taken Republicans back to their isolationist and economic nationalist roots, we are left without a free trade party. And it used to be that we would look at periods of time, we would have relatively easy time making trade policy and advancing initiatives in trade if you had a Republican president, especially if you had unified government. And I was not particularly happy during those periods for other reasons, but at least in this field, a lot was being accomplished. If we don't have a free trade party, we don't have anyone acting as the advocate for maintaining the US position of providing leadership and support and stability in the trading system. Now, what we do have is a series of contests within each of the parties. And within the Democratic Party, it's a question of who is going to come out on top. Is it going to be the internationalist wing that really we can associate largely with Joe Biden? If you ask yourself, what are the fundamentals that matter to Joe Biden as president-elect, which he may soon be? I will start from the assumption that he will soon be. Rule of law, internationalism, working with allies. Trade liberalization per se, not a priority, but what we do within trade, operating within the rules and in cooperation with our allies, a much higher priority. There'll be a conflict in the coming years between that internationalist wing of the Democratic Party and the progressive wing. The progressive wing is trade skeptical by nature, very concerned about any issue that is associated with the interests of business over the interests of working people and consumers, is much more interested in social issues than in foreign policy. And if we start from the assumption that Joe Biden is likely to be a one-term president, and what other Democrats are going to be interested in is whether the next candidate is going to be from the internationalist wing or from the progressive wing, that means that he has as much of an internal struggle in any initiative that he might want to undertake in trade policy as he does a struggle with the Republicans. Now, on the Republican side, what are the factions we may have there? Well, Trump is not going to go quietly into that good night. Trump is likely to not only be kicking and screaming between now and January 20th, but there's every expectation that in the future he will try to retain authority and influence within the Republican Party and be a challenge to the position of someone like Mitch McConnell. As I see it, there will be essentially three factions within the Republican Party in the foreseeable future. The legislative faction led by McConnell that will define themselves primarily by their desire to block Biden initiatives or other Democratic initiatives, and even still continuing to try to undo policies from the Obama era. There will be the Trump wing, which is, as I say, is more of a cult of personality than anything else. And then there will be the never Trumpers, who those people who had provided some of the intellectual, philosophical foundations of what it meant to be a Republican the last 10 years, the last 20, the last 30 years. I don't expect them to be very successful in their efforts to try to rebuild a principled Republican Party on their own, because I don't think it's fundamentally a philosophical movement. I think it has to have a leader like a Ronald Reagan or someone else who can not only have positions, but articulate them in a way that is attractive both to the thinkers and to the rank and file. Who will that be? When will a person of that nature show up? I couldn't possibly predict, but probably not within this next 2-year period. So this struggle is going to be underway within the Republican Party, is defining what it's supposed to be about, and within the Democratic Party trying to define what its future is all about. And as between those two groups, trade policy is not likely to be a particularly high priority. One thing that I do in looking at the election results in 2020 is it was sort of a lost opportunity for this election to have been a referendum on Trump's economic policies. I had been anticipating since he was inaugurated 4 years ago that ultimately he would be a one-term president, but I did that predicated on the assumption that at a certain point he would, like almost all presidents, have to deal with a recession, and that recession would be his undoing. Well, that's sort of been true, because we've had a pandemic and a recession, and the argument will be made that these two things combined have contributed to his undoing. But he will respond, and others will respond, that the recession we have had has been essentially a medically induced coma. And they will argue that the economy is bad only to the extent that we had a health crisis that was being managed. And if you do look at public opinion polling, the one thing that the public was saying that they liked about Trump was he was doing well with the economy. Now, does that mean that they were supporting his positions on trade? Not really, because if you ask people, did they support an open global economy, that they think protectionism or free trade are good? Over time, we've had an increasing share of the public that believes in open markets, even though they support a man who very evidently did not. What I've been arguing for some time is what we really need to see is a Democrat come around who would be a reverse Trump. We need to have a Democrat who would show up and look at the field of other contenders for the presidency and say, you know, if I take the free trade position, I'll be the only one of these 17 who does so in exactly the same way that Trump was the only one of the 18 who took a protectionist position. And perhaps I will attract to myself a proper constituency and lead this party back to a pro-market orientation. That didn't happen in 2020. I doubt whether it'll happen in 2024, but you know, sometimes we have to have the triumph of hope over experience. In any case, we did not have 2020 be a referendum on Trump's economic performance, because if anything, it was a referendum on his governance, but it was his governance in the pandemic. And we don't know if, but for the pandemic, we might have ended up in a recession anyway. We were due for one, but we'll never know if we would have had one. Now, what I do expect is both parties will continue to struggle over who has the support of the people who define themselves as the losers in a global economy. And what Trump really did was he saw an underserved market there. Part of what I try to do in my book is show through some statistical exercises how policymakers in the elected arms of government, in Congress and the executive, over the previous 25 years had progressively spent less and less time dealing with trade. It was an under-addressed issue, and certainly within the Republican Party, there was no one else who was taking a protectionist position. Trump saw this underserved market and sought to appeal to it. That's a lot of the key to his success 4 years ago. And if you look at the messages that we get from Joe Biden on trade, he certainly has tried to outdo Trump on Buy American policy and economic nationalism in that sense. I would anticipate that a Biden trade policy will be one that differs from a Trump trade policy in a number of respects, but procurement is one where he wants to be at least as economically nationalist, and it'll probably have more consequence to it because he will put forward, if he could get it through Congress, a much more vigorous infrastructure program and government investment that'll make a difference in steel and concrete and so forth. So that's what I have to say about the domestic politics of trade. Let me turn to the international politics of trade. And this is part of why I entitled my presentation, Either Way, It's Worse Than You Think. We don't change the environment in which the United States operates simply by changing the leader. The trends over time, which could have been charted on a graph a generation ago, and in fact, the people I studied under did chart this on a graph, they anticipated that something like Trump would come along because of shifts in the global distribution of power and wealth. It's just that it took a very long time for this to happen, and part of what I try to do in my book is explain the various ways that American presidents from Carter through Obama tried to find ways to control the demands for protection and to channel demands for change in policy towards, for instance, the adoption of new issues in trade policy, intellectual property rights, investment services, and also new ways of negotiating agreements, free trade agreements and other discriminatory instruments. And I argue that they postponed a reckoning with the protectionist demands that were a natural consequence of the relative decline of the United States within the global structure. But the pressures built up over time, and those pressures propelled Trump into office. Just because Biden is in some sense the anti-Trump does not mean that Biden will oppose what Trump's positions were on all issues. So what we have witnessed over time is a declining US willingness and ability to provide leadership at the multilateral level. What we've instead seen is a progressive move away from multilateral trade initiatives and towards discriminatory trade initiatives. And arguably, the only real difference that you see in Trump's policies in this respect is he quite vigorously has pursued exclusive economic blocks. So, for instance, obliging Canada and Mexico to agree in the revised NAFTA to a provision that in effect says they cannot negotiate free trade agreements with China. The desire on Trump's part to negotiate other agreements with countries that would not merely be agreements in which China does not participate, but in fact be agreements in which those countries are being brought on board in an explicit bloc that is against China. Now, to some extent, this is picking up themes that were already underway in the George W. Bush administration and carried over into the Obama administration. The Trans-Pacific Partnership, which now goes by a new title and the United States is not in it, was initially conceived as an Asian Pacific bloc that was there very much defined not by who's in it, but by who is not in it, China not being. The only thing that Trump did was change the explicit nature of that type of negotiation. Now, he also changed the economic content, and I would argue that a free trade agreement negotiated by Trump is one that is fundamentally different from free trade agreements that we had conceived of in the past, because they were supposed to be about getting government out of the way and creating the market opportunities for the market to decide what the outcomes would be. So they were about creating opportunity, and the outcome will follow. A trade agreement negotiated by Trump focuses on the outcome. So having, for instance, explicit market sharing provisions within the agreement, whether we're negotiating with an ally or an adversary. So Trump would demand that China commit to certain levels of purchases from the United States and make similar or at least comparable demands of other countries and engage in market sharing in a way that we haven't seen any administration do since, as I said before, the first term of the Reagan administration. So where are we now? No matter who was going to win this election, we would still have the United States in a rivalry with China. We would still have the United States in a relatively diminished position. We would still have the United States less interested in pursuing multilateral liberalization. But Trump picked up strands from his predecessor that, even though he tried to present his policies as fundamentally different, I would argue that there's a certain continuity from Bush to Obama to Trump to Biden in the following way. Trump initiated FTA negotiations with the United Kingdom and the European Union that were in effect the successor negotiation to the failed attempt in the Obama administration to create a transatlantic free trade agreement. And he initiated bilateral FTA negotiations with Japan, which are in effect the successor, that and the revised NAFTA agreement were the successor to the Bush-Obama initiative of a Trans-Pacific Partnership. Different in the sense I suggested about being focused on outcomes rather than opportunities, but fundamentally the same in the following way, which is over time, the share of our trade that is defined by extra WTO agreements has been steadily increasing. And if you look at the share of US exports and the share of US imports that would be covered by free trade agreements, if and when we conclude the FTAs with the European Union, the United Kingdom, and Japan, and you add them to the 20 free trade agreement partners that Trump inherited from the past, and we have gone from FTAs being the exception to the multilateral rule to being the rule for which the multilateral system is the exception. And the WTO will progressively be viewed by US policymakers as the place where we deal with China. Where we deal with China and whoever else we do not have an FTA with. And if the WTO becomes primarily an institution that is devoted to adjudication of disputes over existing agreements and not an institution where we are negotiating new agreements on a multilateral basis, I have to question how sustainable that may be over time. So the question that arises, would Biden abandon the FTA negotiations that he inherits from Trump, which in effect are at least in some sense inherited from the prior two administrations? I don't think he would. There's a very strong tradition in this country that our major trade initiatives are multi-administration. It's relatively rare for a significant trade agreement to be initiated, concluded, approved, and implemented all under one president. George W. Bush did a number of free trade agreements in that respect, but even so, some of his FTAs he inherited from the Clinton administration, some of his FTAs did not get implemented until the Obama administration. And multilateral negotiations and major FTAs tend to be multi-administration, and our presidents tend not to abandon the negotiations that they inherit from their predecessors. So Biden could. I haven't heard him say anything about it, but I would anticipate that having engaged in those negotiations, he will continue and conclude those negotiations. The one thing where I doubt that there will be continuity is in the one completely new FTA negotiation that was initiated in the Trump administration, which is with Kenya. And in some work that I've recently done, I've tried to advise our African friends, Kenya and the others, that the principal reason that that agreement was being negotiated was as a successor to the African Growth and Opportunities Act on the expectation that that regional program was likely to expire, and quite probably it would expire in a second-term Trump administration. I fully anticipate that the AGOA preferences will continue under a Biden administration. Why? Well, if there's any group to which Biden owes his political life, both for being elected and perhaps most importantly for getting the nomination and not having died in the middle of the nominating process, it is the Congressional Black Caucus. It's especially to Representative James Clyburn in South Carolina, who made an extremely valuable intervention, very well timed for Biden. Clyburn is a big advocate of renewal and expansion of AGOA. And if you have AGOA, if you have Kenya having free access to the US market without having to pay for it with a free trade agreement, the logic in favor of going down that route is very significantly reduced. So that one negotiation, I would not be the least bit surprised if it withered and died. But the other ones I anticipate will be continued, and if they are continued and executed, the perception of the value to the United States of the WTO is inevitably, I think, going to decline. I think that is a shame on a number of grounds, but we can anticipate that. As I say, more emphasis, as if it's possible to put more emphasis than Trump did on Buy American. It'll have more consequence, I think, because there'll be more government spending, unless that's constrained by Republicans in Congress. What we're going to see changing is the form and the instruments of trade policy. The form and the tone, a Biden administration will be more rhetorically and philosophically oriented towards cooperation, especially with friendly countries, less likely to be critical of allies, less likely to cozy up to dictators, more likely to express support for the notion that the United States needs to cooperate with other countries, and less prone to ignore legal strictures. So some of the instruments of law that the Trump administration dusted off the shelves that had not been used since the time of the Uruguay round, Section 301, the reciprocity law of the United States, Section 232, the national security law in trade policy, that Trump began to use that we had not seen an American president use since the Reagan administration, those are likely to be put back up on the shelf. But beyond that, and also a greater propensity to speak to diaspora politics, by which I mean presidential trade initiatives that are defined in part by speaking to the constituency interests of Americans of Latin American origin, of Caribbean origin, of African origin, which we've seen from previous Democratic presidents, and I would fully anticipate to see continued under Biden. Those are the differences, but in some sense, even without Trump, some aspects of Trumpism will continue. And that would be very insulting to a lot of Democrats, but nonetheless, being at least indifferent to the role of the United States in leading the trading system, a continued concern over conflict with China, a further drift towards discrimination, all of those things are as likely to continue as they may be to change. As I say, I would anticipate the possibility that at some point in the future, we could have a Democrat who becomes the reverse Trump and speaks to that large share of the Democratic constituency that says it supports open markets and would support free trade. But no one did that this year, and I really seriously question whether anyone will in looking for the nomination the next time around. So those are the main points that I wanted to make. I've probably gone over my time, but I hope that we've spawned some questions and comments in the meantime.
Thank you very much, Craig. While you were speaking, and thanks to Antoine, Trump tweeted again, and he said, all of the recent Biden claimed states will be legally challenged by us. for voter fraud and state election fraud. Plenty of proof, just check out the media. And then capitals, we will win, America first. And that is the end of Donald Trump's tweet minutes ago. Again, thank you to Antoine. I don't think it is a surprise, again, this tweet. And precisely, I would like to go back, Craig, if you don't mind, to the domestic sort of issues. And of course, opening the floor to question and answers. And the first question regarding the domestic aspect of this process is the bipartitism, the system itself. Is it a curse or a blessing to have two parties alternating since now, more than 200 years? And is there any room in the future, of course, for more parties, as in other democracies, as we are used here, for instance, in Europe, even to have coalitions of different parties?
Okay, very good question, because it allows me to address two different aspects of the same issue, which is political culture. And when I'm lecturing next week in some classes that I'm giving in this trade course, one of the things that I will try to get across is political culture in the United States is very different from many other countries' political cultures. And one of the first errors that almost anyone makes in this field, and as Manuela knows, most of my career has been devoted to trying to explain the United States to its trading partners, is the biggest mistake you can make is to look at how things operate here according to how they operate in your own country, and to assume that even institutions that have the same name might operate in the same way. So when I'm speaking to people who are from a Commonwealth country, I'll ask them, do you have a position in your country called Speaker of the House? Oh yes, they all have a Speaker of the House. And I ask them to describe how that role functions. And then I describe how the Speaker of the House does in the United States. And it turns out that they are radically different institutions, so they have entirely distinct functions, but they sound the same because they go by the same title. We do not have coalition government in the United States, except in very rare circumstances. When Abraham Lincoln ran for re-election in 1864 and the Civil War had not yet concluded, he ran on the ticket not of the Republican Party, but the National Union Party, which brought together Republicans and Democrats who were in favor of maintaining the national government. Very special case. When John McCain received the nomination in 2008, there were some people who said, you know what you should do? You should ask one of your good Democratic friends to be your running mate. And he said, no, that's contrary to our institutions. I really can't do that. When Gerald Ford came into the presidency upon the resignation of Richard Nixon, some people said, you know, we're in a very difficult spot right now. Wouldn't it be helpful if we created a political coalition you could nominate as your vice president a Democrat? My point here is that every once in a while, people come up with the notion that we ought to have a coalition of some sense. And it almost never happens. And the only time it really did, in form at least, was during the US Civil War, which is now well over 100 years ago, 160 years ago. It does not happen. We have one very silly tradition, which is the president informing his cabinet will offer at least one position to a member of the opposition party. And usually they look at the cabinet and they say, what's the least important position? Oh, Secretary of Transportation. So you'll have a Secretary of Transportation who is from the other party. Now, occasionally you do get more important positions like Secretary of Defense, but it's rare that that happens. Joe Biden has indicated a willingness to have a few more Republicans in his cabinet than is normal. And perhaps that will happen. But a coalition government per se, it does not happen. American political culture is predicated on two very important points. One is that we are very much dedicated to having two parties and two parties only. Third parties, people put them forward every several years. You know, we have a Libertarian Party, we have a Green Party, there's the Socialist Workers Party and so forth, and they will get at a maximum in an unusual election up to 5% of the vote. but they're always considered spoilers, and whose only consequence is drawing votes away that may otherwise have gone to some other candidate. So we have only the two parties. We have the same two parties that we've had since the time of the Civil War, and I think that is going to be a permanent part of our system. But just the other point that I make about political culture, what we do about those parties and how those parties operate varies over time. So when I first came to Washington in the early 1980s, the expectation at that time was that the opposition party, the minority party, would make a lot of noise and oppose the president, primarily in order to increase its leverage in order to participate ultimately in the making of policy. And that has changed. And we've gone to a system where the role of the opposition party is perceived usually as being everything you can do to block the other side. And I would say that the fundamental change took place in the Clinton administration. And what happened was Bill Clinton was so seriously hated by Republicans that there was this shift. Because I can tell you that when I lived here and worked here in the Reagan administration, in the George H.W. Bush administration, Democrats would give both of those presidents a hard time, but ultimately those presidents would try to cooperate with Democrats when they could in policymaking, including in trade. And the way we made trade policy at that time was largely through the negotiation of omnibus trade bills that made their way through Congress, and they were very much ultimately bipartisan. And that hasn't been how we've made trade policy lately. Joe Biden has said he's going to try to work with Republicans. I seriously believe that he will make an effort to return to a system more like the one that I was brought up on all those years ago, but I don't think he's going to get a lot of cooperation from Mitch McConnell. Back to you, Manuel.
Thank you, Craig. There is a question here from Cecile regarding the foreign policy in general. So you spoke about trade, and I think this is quite clear that we have to look at the long-term trends regarding the US trade policy. But what about other issues like peace and security issues, health, climate? We know already that Biden promised this morning to rejoin the Paris Agreement, for instance, and some other global issues, global public goods, because what I saw in the platform, in the document of the Democrat Party is really extremely vague on everything. So maybe you can clarify a little bit on that if we know more.
Okay, first of all, thank you for the question. There's one sense in which I would say the Republicans were actually a bit honest by having no platform at all, because I think in other countries, one aspect of political culture is you take very seriously a party manifesto. And in this country, we have come over time to view them as being an anachronism. We don't really care that much what they say. We do not have strong political parties. Parties have no control over their members. Parties are loose associations. And the platform is something that is done as window dressing for purposes of the election. So I wouldn't look to the platform per se. I would ask myself on each of these issues, and they have to be disaggregated, not just into broad categories like peace and security, climate, health, and so forth, but into specific initiatives and specific proposals that might come up and attach to a specific partner or set of partners or region of the world. I would anticipate as a general rule, Biden will be much more interested in international cooperation. Biden will be much more interested in the rule of law. Biden will be much more interested in international institutions than Trump was. Biden is vastly better informed on these issues, both by dint of his lengthy experience in the Senate, where foreign policy was a greater emphasis for him than it is for most senators, and also his role as a vice president. So he'll be engaged on those issues. But as for what precisely he would do on each one of them, I think we want to know more about who's going to be in the cabinet what they anticipate would be the issues that they can and cannot get through a Congress that in which at least one of the chambers is going to be controlled by the opposition party. I'd be happier to make my guesses about individual issues than about foreign policy broadly, but the theme of cooperation with allies, opposition to dictators and so forth, those are things that I think go a little bit beyond mere rhetoric and are things on which I would anticipate Biden to actually take action.
And in this regard, I have a question that is more or less related to this from Roger. The Democrats show until now that they are united against Trump, even if the platform is not very strong and not very clear, but it is really united against Trump. But will they be able to stay united as a party in the post-Trump era? Do you think it is sustainable to keep that unity?
No. The metaphor that people have used to describe Democrats all my adult life, and I think before my adult life, is the circular firing squad, which is to say, we all get in a circle and aim our guns at the person in front of us. Will Rogers was a very famous American humorist in the 1930s and 40s, and he said, "I'm not a member of any organized political party, I'm a Democrat." So we don't have a tradition of strong party leadership. Again, when I said before, there's a difference between the Speaker of the House in the US Congress versus the Speaker of the House in the British Parliament or other parliaments around the world. There's also a difference between the role of the whip. So our parties have whips, and the purpose of the whip in the parliamentary system is usually to ensure to the maximum extent party unity. The role of the whip is to hope, to beg, to cajole, to see to it that the members of your party have some sort of unity on an issue. But we really do not have party discipline. We have serious factions. We have different factions. We have parties in the United States are more a creature at the state level than at the national level. So a Democrat from Montana is as different from a Democrat in Florida as either of those people are with the Republicans in their respective states. And this is a problem for any president. Republicans have a tradition of being more unified than Democrats do. But for reasons I explained in my presentation, I anticipate that it will be very much, there will be an awful lot of internal party discord among the Republicans in the years to come. If you look at the statistics on how members of Congress lose their seats, there are more members of Congress in the last 20 years or so who have lost their seats because they were challenged within their own party for the nomination than lost their seats because they were defeated by the nominee of the other party. And this is where the word primary has become a verb. So a primary election in the United States is the election where you choose the nominee of your party, and we use that as an adjective, primary election, but we now use it as a verb, as in, he's afraid of being primaried. So there are a lot of Republicans who thought that they might want to oppose Donald Trump on one issue or another because they thought he was too extreme, or they didn't like his tone, or they didn't like his position on a particular issue. And they held their hand and did not criticize him because they didn't want to be primaried. And the same is true within the Democratic Party. If you are perceived to be too much of a centrist, vis-a-vis the center of gravity within your party at your state level, you're in danger of being primary. This is more of a problem among Republicans than it is among Democrats, but it is the concern about being primary that has more control, that is more likely to press our partisans into some unity within their respective groups than is the role of the whip, for example. But again, always bear in mind that an American political party is not a terribly well-organized thing.
And to conclude on this issue, there is a question from David regarding the role or the voice, the noise of the minority led by Bernie Sanders within the Democrat Party. Do you think this influence will be meaningful in the next few years in the domestic issues in particular, and within the life of the Democrat Party?
Absolutely. And this is what I meant before about there being a question about the struggle between the internationalist wing and the progressive wing. And the only reason I didn't mention Bernie Sanders is because I think that he is becoming less of a factor. Age is always going to be an issue, although despite the fact that he actually had a heart attack earlier this year, he's a very active man. But Senator Elizabeth Warren, I think, is going to take up more of a role as Sanders gets older. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and the members of what are called the Squad, Ilhan Omar and other women who were newly elected 2 years ago to Congress. This progressive wing, a lot of what Biden does or thinks about doing in policymaking, he has to think about how that's going to be seen on his left flank and on his right flank. And on his right flank, he has to ask himself, to what extent can I get cooperation or at least reduced opposition from Republicans? On his left flank, he has to ask himself, what is this going to mean for Democratic Party unity? That and his age and his health and the very, very narrow victory he's likely to eke out, possibly by the smallest number of acceptable electoral votes. For all of these reasons, I anticipate that Biden will find governance much more difficult than most first-term presidents, but he could prove me wrong.
Yeah, thank you. I have 3 questions from Simonetta. 2 of them are related to the WTO, and the first one is a more political one. We were here in Europe, more or less everybody was waiting for a sort of blue wave, not a tsunami, but certainly a blue wave. And what we see is really a very small wave in terms of blue as compared to the Trump votes, whatever is the result, I mean. So how come there was no blue wave as expected from some perspectives? And then the questions regarding the WTO, the proliferation of free trade agreements, as you mentioned in your presentation, probably will make the WTO less interesting also for other countries, including the European Union, maybe. And in this context also, what is blocking the appointment of the WTO Director General, since the US is now the only country that is opposing to the consensus that was reached?
Okay, good and very different questions. Thank you, Simonetta. Why no blue wave? Let me take a step back for a moment and just consider things from the perspective of my profession, because I am by training a political scientist. We're having a very active debate right now on whether we should put any value anymore in polls. Because a lot of the subtext in my profession, at least, in the last year has been, can the pollsters do a better job this year than they did 4 years ago? And the general consensus, I think, over time was, well, if you look at it very carefully, the pollsters were not as wrong in 2016 as people seem to think they were. If you look at what they were saying towards the end of the election, they were getting the national vote almost right. They were off by about 2 or 3 percentage points. Where they were making their errors was at the state level. If you look at how pollsters performed versus how the votes have actually come in over these last few days, at the national level, we won't know for a while what the final breakdown is, but at present, it looks like maybe Biden will have beat Trump by about 3% in the national popular vote. Maybe as more votes come in from California, it'll grow beyond 3 to 4, maybe 5%, who knows? But it's way below what the averages were telling us. The averages told us that he was going to beat Trump by about 8 or 9%. That's what the polls were saying in the last week of the election. So they got that wrong. And then at the state level, it's a more nuanced issue. I followed obsessively for the last several months all the projections of where we were headed in the Electoral College and what different groups thought might be the outcome here. I will say that the typical prognosticator in the last week or so thought if they declared every state, if they said, I absolutely believe here's what's going to happen with each state, they were saying that Biden was going to get 320 to 350 electoral votes. We know that no matter what happens in Georgia, Pennsylvania, et cetera, he's not going to be anywhere near 320 or 350 electoral votes. What we're instead seeing is a lot of the consensus among prognosticators, forecasters, was that Biden probably could count on about 290 electoral votes, Trump on about 135, and all the rest in the middle were swing states. If it in fact is the case that Biden gets Nevada, Arizona, and Pennsylvania, he'll have that 290. It's just that Trump will have gotten everything that Trump was expected to get, and Trump will have won essentially all of the swing states, except the composition may be a little different because I think there was more expectation that Georgia would go with Trump, and it's looking more and more like Biden will end up getting Georgia. But if he ends up with about 290 electoral votes, I would say actually, in a sense, at the state level, the pollsters were not that off. But I think one thing that they're going to have to work on is the question of, are we reaching everyone in our polls? Because the consensus coming out of the last time was, we're not weighting our polls enough for education. And when we don't have people of a certain low educational attainment being measured sufficiently, they're not reflected in our numbers. So part of the issue is there a shy Trump voter? Is there someone who really wants to vote for Trump, but they don't want to say they're going to vote for Trump? And this is going to be part of the wrangling among pollsters in the future. My own initial feeling, if you asked me yesterday, I'd say the pollsters were wrong. If you ask me today and I look at the data, I'm a little bit more forgiving towards them. But when you ask, why was there not a blue wave? Remember that this is an expectation game. You were expecting a blue wave because the pollsters were telling you so. And we saw considerably less of that. And if you want to ask who was not voting for Trump, or who was voting for Trump that we had not measured properly, there's some surprising results if you look at the exit polls. He had been saying for several years that he was going to do better among Black voters, and especially Black men, than he had before. And you know what? He did. Trump was winning more of the African-American male vote than people had expected, and more of the Hispanic vote than had been expected. So between performing better in some constituencies than people had thought, and the pollsters making more errors than they ought to, and possibly errors in how we're measuring these things as pollsters, the wave that we had anticipated can be explained, but there's still a lot more debate to take place in the pollster community. The appointment of the DG, I have to admit that I really like to be in Geneva a couple of times a year and talk to people and pick things up. When I'm not in Geneva, I don't hear what the discussion is on these issues. So when you're talking about what's essentially the inside baseball questions of what's going on in WTO politics, I hesitate to give an answer if I don't know. I will say that the Trump administration is definitely not shy about being out there on its own on any given issue, including the appointment of the DG. If we were looking at a second Trump term, I would be reminding people of something I wrote in my history of the WTO that most people don't realize is the case. WTO rules actually allow for the expulsion of a country. They allow for the expulsion of a country if it abuses the rule of consensus. And I've had people within the WTO tell me, oh, this can't be true. And I would then show them the exact provisions of the WTO agreements that provide for this. And they're shocked to realize that it is in there. I don't think it would come to that in a second Trump term. It would be much more likely that eventually in some grand gesture, futile gesture, Trump would pull the United States out of the WTO, which, as I say, he might still do in the remaining time that he has. But if a country really is abusing the process, there always is the possibility that on procedural issues, not on substantive issues, but on procedural issues, we might consider slipping over to voting. After all, the appointment of the DG is one of the few processes that really is, at least in the selection of the candidates, voting based. It's a kind of voting. So there's a way around that, and I think countries would be well advised to think about that if we had a second Trump term, but we won't, I think. So it's likely to be a moot point.
Okay, Craig, there is a question moving back to the system, the electoral system, the electoral college. Guido was asking if there is a chance sometime in the future the US will ever abandon the system of the electoral college and revert to a simple majority vote, a more direct vote, again, as we are used here in the European democracies. Because as far as I know, I mean, this system of the electoral college was originated during the independence days, I mean, at the beginning of the US history, is that right?
Yes, the answer to your question is no and yes. I'll give you the no and then I'll give you the yes. The no is, I cannot imagine that anyone would successfully amend the Constitution to provide for a change in the Electoral College, for the simple reason that the Electoral College system works very, very much to the advantage of small states. And those small states, by the rules by which you can amend the Constitution, those small states have the same level of influence. If you ever had a constitutional convention or a constitutional amendment that got sent out to the states for approval, it would never be approved by the small states that want to continue to have a disproportionate authority in the Electoral College. But interestingly, there's a growing movement within state legislatures to change the rules of every state, one, by which the electors of every state would go to the winner of the national popular vote. So, for instance, if you're in the state of Texas or in the state of Nebraska, and you've got your 38 or your 3 electoral votes, as the case may be, if enough states approved this individually, it would change the way that presidential candidates campaign for office. If each individual state made the pledge that no matter what our vote total was, we will go with the winner of the national electoral vote, the popular vote. Sorry, I should say the popular vote. This movement is gaining some steam in some states. The question is whether it would happen with enough that it made a difference. In the meantime, the other compromise move is states are considering whether they should do what Maine and Nebraska have done, which is award their electoral votes in part on the basis of congressional districts. So if you've been paying close attention to the math of the Electoral College the last couple of days, you'll see, although Maine will go for Biden, one of their votes may go for Trump, and just the exact reverse may be true in the case of Nebraska. And that moves us a little bit closer to a system that is not like the winner take all that we have. For the time being, I anticipate that we're probably going to maintain this type of arrangement for the foreseeable future. And yes, it goes back to the original Constitution, and it stems from the notion that the federal government is really supposed to be the confederation of semi-independent states. And it's only over time that we've come to think more in national terms than state terms. But it was a compromise intended to bring along big states and small states when we had only 13 of them.
Yeah, thank you. I would advise to look at the Swiss system for some inspiration regarding the federal system and how a democracy can work in that structure. But there is a question that is not related to that, but more to the circumstances of the COVID, the pandemic, and how it played a role. You refer to that in your presentation, but I think everybody's surprised here from the European perspective, and there was a question in that direction. Surprised because the management of the pandemic didn't play as much as a role in the campaign, in the electoral process results and so on, as expected. I mean, here in Europe, all the governments are in trouble just because of that, because they're all being accused for good or bad reasons of their bad management of the pandemic. And it is the only issue these days here. So we do not see exactly that. So it is not mirrored in what we perceive from the US discussions and elections. Is that right?
If I had to bring my observations of the public response to COVID down to one simple observation, it would be people tended to view it through the lenses of their partisan glasses. And it took existing partisan preferences and exacerbated them. So if you are a Republican in this country, especially if you are a Trump Republican, there's a very strong possibility that you believe that COVID is a hoax. You believe that everything that the president has done is right. You believe that he should get full credit for developing a vaccine. I mean, some of this is self-contradictory, but he should get the credit for a vaccine as well, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And wearing a mask is a political statement, and you would not be caught dead wearing a mask, and so forth. Democrats are much more likely to wear masks, engage in social distancing, blame the president for everything that has gone wrong. But as I said before, people forgive the economic failings because they view the economic failings as the response to a pandemic that, after all, if you're a Republican and you agree that it exists, you say it's China's fault. I mean, what people do is they have many different ways of justifying their positions, and we end up not judging the president on the basis of what he's done on COVID, but rather we judge COVID on the basis of what our partisan attachments may be. And it can very easily fit within whatever narrative you have predetermined you're going to find convincing to yourself. I would say that in the absence of the pandemic, that the outcome of this election would have been determined by whether or not we had a recession. And no one can tell me with any certainty that we would or would not otherwise have had a recession. But I've told people this before, and I'll say it again. If you look at the history of presidents who have run for re-election for a second term since the Second World War, every single one who had a recession in the second year of his first term got defeated. And every single one who either didn't have a recession at all or had that recession only in the first 2 years of his term, every single one of them got reelected. We never before had a president who ran for reelection when a recession was underway. So if you can tell me with absolute certainty whether we would otherwise have had a recession underway in the year 2020 in the absence of COVID, I can tell you with absolute certainty what the results of the election would be. But as I say, because people now say that our economic downturn is attributable solely to COVID, we don't have to ask the more difficult question of whether we approve the individual economic policies, including in trade, that this government undertook.
Yeah, thank you, Craig. We are running out of time, but I would like to ask you a final question to lead us to a sort of conclusion insofar as possible of this brainstorming and discussion. If you know perfectly well that the credibility of the solidity of the democracy, the democratic system of the US was really hit very bad in this process because of Trump behavior and his attitude. And for instance, you look at the editorials of the New York Times today, and also 2 editorials of Le Monde today, which are particularly aggressive in this regard, and I think they are right. If you were Biden tomorrow, what would you do to restore the credibility of the US democracy, at least insofar as possible as a Democrat party?
I think that, in fact, this will be a priority for Biden. But just at a philosophical level, you could ask the question, how does one teach virtue? Well, we teach virtue by practicing virtue. And how do we teach bipartisanship? How do we teach basic human decency? We do it by practicing it. And Joe Biden is fundamentally, I think, a very decent person. And I think he will make more of an effort than most first-term presidents do, of necessity, but also based on his his essential being, to be more inclusive and to try to work, if he can, with Republicans. I guess the most immediate test we're going to have is what sort of transition we have. And the question arises, if we get to the point in the next several days or the next week or so where it is evident that the electoral votes are there and anything that Trump does to deny them is just going to prolong the agony, will Mitch McConnell and other Republicans, in essence, go to Trump, or for that matter, go to Biden and say, enough of this? We need to do a few essential things, including we have to pass the new stimulus bill to deal with the COVID crisis. And there's some pending business we need to deal with. Between now and January 20th, they will have a lot of opportunities to help set that tone. My own expectation is that Biden will do everything that he can in order to establish a positive tone, but it really does take two to tango. And one of the stories you often hear about just good common political sense and virtue in a party is related to Senator Goldwater. Barry Goldwater, extremely conservative senator who ran against President Johnson in 1964, thoroughly defeated. Goldwater is given the credit in the next decade for leading the group that went to Richard Nixon when it was very evident that if he didn't act to resign soon, he was going to be removed by Congress. He's going to be impeached by the House, and he's going to be tried and removed by the Senate. They went to him and they said, Mr. President, you really have to face facts and resign. There are people who are asking if Mitch McConnell at long last will do something like that in the coming days, if it's really evident that Trump has lost. And it's really a two-part question. One, would McConnell do it? Two, would Trump react with anything other than a temper tantrum, which is how he always has reacted so far. So we'll see at least how McConnell wants to handle this. And it may be that McConnell takes action that would give us one last opportunity to see what sort of character Trump has. But from Biden's intent, Biden clearly intends to be less partisan. The environment in which he's operating may not make it easy to do so.
Okay, well, let's hope for the best, because really I think this is the main concern that we all have in mind these days. I will give the floor to Alejandro for some concluding remarks, unless, Craig, you want to add anything to conclude this topic and this session?
No, other than to say I miss visiting you all in Geneva. I'm hoping that maybe by this time next year, I can be mobile again.
Yeah, we all hope so. Let's see. Okay, Alejandro, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Manuela, and thank you very much, Craig. Of course, it will be great to have you here in Geneva and have our next great talk in person. Thank you very much for today's great talk and for your continued participation in our great talks. This one indeed was a continuation and a great update on your previous talk. I will not really try to summarize your historical conjunctural analysis or your vision for the future. I just wonder if we could agree to make one joint prediction. If we could have you again with us sometime around Thursday, January 7th, for a new update on what is going on and what is your vision of what will, including what happened from today till that date. Could we agree?
If people haven't gotten sick of me, I'm available. As long as I know in advance, I can definitely put it in my calendar. It's not like I'm going anywhere else.
Me neither. Well, thank you really very much, Craig. We abused of your time. It was a great session. Looking forward to see you all, and thank you to all the participants. See you.
Thank you.